They told us fear was normal, that every child woke to sirens and falling ash. I believed them. I thought every world shook under bombardment, and every morning began with casualty lists echoing through the Vox. Only later did I learn other children played games, while we learned to hide. I was 6 years old the first time I truly understood what the sirens meant. Not in words I couldn't read yet, couldn't pass the Gothic script that scrolled across the emergency broadcast screens in the transit corridors, but in rhythm, in pattern, in the way my body responded before my mind caught up. 3 short blasts, sharp and urgent, meant distant artillery. The kind that shook dust from the ceiling, but didn't break walls. 2 long wails, rising and falling like the cry of something dying, meant enemy aircraft overhead. Time to find the nearest shelter, to press yourself against rockcrete, and pray the building held. 1 continuous scream, unwavering and relentless, meant run. Just run. Don't ask where, don't ask why. Just move, because staying still meant death. My mother never explained the system to me. She didn't need to. By the time you could walk in Verum Tertius, you knew the language of survival by heart. It was written into your bones, into the way your pulse quickened at certain frequencies, into the instinct that made you freeze when the air pressure changed just before an impact. You learned it the way other children learn nursery rhymes, through repetition, through necessity, through watching what happened to those who didn't learn fast enough. Our hive was called Verum Tertius, though I never knew why. A cluster of industrial towers built into the side of a mountain range on a world whose name no one ever spoke aloud, as if naming it would make the horror more real. The towers rose like broken teeth from the grey stone, connected by transit tubes and supply bridges that swayed when the wind blew hard enough or when the shelling came too close. The Emperor's name was everywhere, carved into lintels above doorways, stamped onto ration tins in faded ink, shouted through voxcasters every morning at dawn in voices that crackled with static and exhaustion. But no one ever told us what world we lived on, or why the enemy wanted it badly enough to kill us for it, or how long the war had been going on. We just knew it had always been this way. And that was enough. The walls of our hab block were thin, cheap, rockcrete mixed with something lighter, something that cracked and crumbled when you pressed your thumb against it hard enough. I know because I tried once, when I was very young, carving my name into the wall beside my cot with a piece of broken rebar I'd found in the corridor. My mother saw and slapped my hand away, her face pale and tight with something I didn't recognize then but understand now as fear. "Don't," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make marks. Don't leave traces. Don't give them a reason to remember you." I didn't understand, but I stopped carving. Dust fell constantly in our quarters, a fine grey powder that settled on every surface: our clothes, our food, the thin blankets we wrapped ourselves in at night. It came from the ceiling, shaken loose by the artillery impacts that rattled the hive day and night. A rhythm so constant you stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing your own breathing. My mother would brush it off my shoulders every morning before I left for the bunker school, her hands moving in slow, practiced circles, her touch gentle despite the roughness of her palms. She never spoke during this ritual, just brushed, her eyes distant, her mouth set in a thin line, as if she were brushing away snow instead of the residue of explosions that had killed our neighbors 3 floors down the night before. I didn't cry when the bombs fell. None of us did. Crying meant you didn't understand yet. Crying meant you were still soft, still clinging to the idea that things could be different, that someone would come and make it stop. And soft children didn't survive long in Verum Tertius. The older kids would look at you with something between pity and contempt if you cried, and the adults would turn away, as if your tears were a contagion they couldn't afford to catch. So you learned quickly. You learned to swallow the sobs, to bite your lip until it bled, to let the fear curdle inside you until it hardened into something cold and manageable. The walk to school took 15 minutes through corridors that stretched like the intestines of some vast, dying machine. The walls were streaked with rust and old burn marks, the lumen strips overhead flickering in irregular patterns that made shadows dance and twist. The older children walked in front, their faces blank and forward-focused, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The younger ones stayed in the middle, clustered together for warmth or comfort or the illusion of safety. And the smallest walked at the back, where the adults could watch them, could count them, could make sure none disappeared between one corridor and the next. We didn't hold hands. We didn't talk. We just walked, our breath fogging in the cold, recycled air, while somewhere above us or below us, or beside us, it was impossible to tell in the hive's twisting geography, the guns kept firing. The bunker school was 3 levels down, carved into the bedrock beneath the hive like a tomb. The entrance was marked with a faded aquila, the paint chipped and scarred by shrapnel, one wing missing entirely. Someone had tried to repaint it once, years ago maybe, but they'd given up halfway through, leaving the eagle lopsided and incomplete. Inside, the air smelled like sweat and mildew and the recycled breath of 200 children packed into a space designed for half that number. The ceiling was low enough that the adults had to stoop, reinforced with steel beams that groaned under the weight of the hive above. The walls wept condensation, thin trails of moisture that pooled on the floor and made the rockcrete slick and treacherous. Our teacher was an old woman named Madame Vrel. Her face was a map of scars, thin white lines across her cheeks, a thick rope of puckered tissue along her jaw, a crater where her left eye should have been, the socket covered with a rough leather patch. She walked with a cane, a length of metal pipe wrapped in friction tape, and it clicked against the floor with every step. A metronome marking the passage of time in a place where time had stopped meaning anything. She never smiled. I don't think she remembered how. The muscles in her face had forgotten the shape of joy, forgotten anything except the tight, controlled expression of someone who'd seen too much and survived by feeling too little. But she was patient in her way. She spoke softly, even when the ceiling shook and dust rained down on our heads, even when the children flinched and covered their ears against the distant thunder of bombardment. She just kept teaching, kept reciting the catechisms and the histories and the endless litanies of Imperial doctrine, as if repetition alone could hold back the chaos pressing in from all sides. Every morning, before lessons began, she read the names, the casualty list. It came through the Vox every dawn, broadcast across the entire hive in a flat, mechanical voice that never wavered, never showed emotion, never acknowledged that the names it spoke had once belonged to people. Madame Vrel would stand at the front of the classroom, her cane propped against the lectern, her good eye scanning the parchment in her gnarled hands, and she would read each name aloud while we sat in silence and listened. Harvin, Jorel, age 43. Manufactorum Collapse, Sector 8. Senna Maris, age 19, killed in action, defensive line Gamma 7. Torvald, Eric, age 12, missing, presumed dead. We didn't react. Not with tears, not with gasps, not with anything that might acknowledge the weight of what we were hearing. We just sat on our cold benches, hands folded in our laps, and absorbed the information the way we absorbed everything else, passively, numbly, with the understanding that resistance was pointless. And if a name belonged to someone we knew, a classmate, a neighbor, a sibling, we made a mental note of it and moved on. Because what else could you do? There were no funerals in Veron Tertius, no memorials, no moments of silence. The dead were tallied, recorded, and forgotten, their bodies dragged to the reclamation furnaces, where they were rendered down into something useful, nutrients, perhaps, or fuel, or raw materials for the manufactorums. Nothing was wasted in the hive, not even grief. One morning, a boy named Kellis wasn't in class. His seat, 3rd row, center, right beside the support pillar that kept the ceiling from collapsing, was empty. Madame Vrel didn't call his name during roll. She didn't need to. We all understood. Kellis had been sitting near the window 2 days ago, during the lesson on devotional hymns, when a shell hit the building across the transit corridor. The blast had shattered the reinforced glass, sending a spray of razored fragments into the classroom with the force of a shotgun blast. Most of us had dropped to the floor immediately, trained by instinct and experience to make ourselves small when the air turned sharp. But Kellis had been slower, or unluckier, or too focused on copying the text from the slate to react in time. The glass had caught him across the face and throat, opening him up in thin red lines that pulsed and sprayed. We'd watched the Medicae carry him out, 2 tired-looking men in stained white coats, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks. They'd wrapped him in a grey sheet, the kind used for corpses, and carried him down the corridor toward the triage station. His blood left a trail on the floor, thin and dark, and someone had mopped it up before the next lesson began. No one mentioned him after that. No one asked what had happened to him, whether he'd survived, whether his family had been notified. We just shifted our seats to fill the gap his absence left, and Madame Vrel continued the lesson, as if nothing had changed. "Today," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the faint tremor in the walls that signaled another distant impact, "we will discuss the nature of duty. The Emperor demands service. Service demands sacrifice. Sacrifice is the highest form of devotion. Repeat after me." And we did. All of us, in unison, our voices flat and mechanical. The Emperor protects. The faithful endure. Fear is weakness. Obedience is strength. I didn't understand the words. Not really. They were just sounds, syllables strung together in a pattern we'd memorized through endless repetition. But I repeated them anyway, because that's what you did in Veron Tertius. You recited the words. You followed the orders. You kept your head down and your voice quiet, and you survived one more day. During recess, if you could call it that, the 15-minute break between lessons when we were allowed to leave the classroom and stretch our legs in the narrow corridor outside, we played games. Not the games other children played. I would learn much later, after the war, after everything. We didn't chase each other, or laugh, or pretend to be heroes from the stories. We played quieter games. Survivable games. Games that taught us skills we'd need when the real tests came. One game was called Count the Thunder. We'd sit in a circle on the cold floor, backs against the wall, and listen to the artillery in the distance. The goal was to guess how many seconds would pass between each impact, to learn the rhythm of the bombardment, to understand the patterns well enough that you could predict when the next shell would fall. The child who guessed closest won. There was no prize. Just the quiet satisfaction of being right, of proving you'd learned to read the language of violence well enough to survive it. Another game was Stay Still. We'd lie flat on the floor during the tremors, the deep, rolling shudders that passed through the hive when something big hit nearby, and see who could remain motionless the longest. No flinching, no crying, no covering your head or curling into a ball. Just perfect, absolute stillness, as if you were already dead and the violence couldn't touch you anymore. The adults thought we were being brave, practicing some kind of quiet fortitude that would serve us well in the Emperor's service. They didn't understand. We weren't being brave. We were learning that fear was useless, that panic would kill you faster than shrapnel, that the only way to survive was to become something less than human, something that didn't feel, didn't react, didn't care whether it lived or died. I had a friend named Sierra. She was small, even for her age, with dark hair that her mother kept cut short to prevent lice, and eyes that seemed too large for her narrow face. She was better at Stay Still than anyone else in our class. She could lie there, perfectly calm, while the walls groaned and the ceiling cracked and the air filled with the shriek of tearing metal. And she wouldn't move. Not once, not even a twitch. I asked her once, whispering so Madame Vrel wouldn't hear and punish us for talking during recess, how she managed it, how she stayed so still when everything inside me screamed to run, to hide, to do something, anything, other than lie there and wait for the world to end. She looked at me with those two large eyes, her expression utterly blank, and said, "I pretend I'm already dead." I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to respond to the casual, matter-of-fact way she'd spoken, as if death were just another game we played, another skill to master. So I said nothing, just looked away and pretended I hadn't heard. But I thought about it during lessons, during the long walks home through the shaking corridors, during the nights when I lay in my cot and listened to the sirens wail. Thought about what it meant to pretend you were already dead, whether it made things easier, whether it hurt less. I never asked her again. One afternoon, we were walking home from school when the sirens started. Two long wails, rising and falling, the sound cutting through the constant background rumble like a knife. Aircraft, enemy bombers overhead. The adults started shouting immediately, their voices sharp with urgency and fear, herding us toward the nearest shelter, toward doorways and alcoves, and anywhere with a roof thick enough to stop shrapnel. But the street was too narrow, too crowded with workers returning from the manufactorums, and there were too many of us. Children and adults pressed together in a mass of bodies, everyone trying to move at once, no one knowing where to go. I pressed myself against the wall, Sierra beside me, and looked up. Through the narrow gap between the buildings, I could see the sky, or what passed for it in Veron Tertius, a grey expanse of smoke and ash, streaked with the white contrails of aircraft moving too fast to track, And somewhere high above, I heard the scream of engines and the rapid, staccato crack of anti-aircraft fire, the sound like someone tearing canvas in half. Then the bombs fell, not on us, not directly, but close enough that I felt the impact before I heard it, a deep, bone-shaking thud that lifted me off my feet and slammed me into the wall. The air turned to fire and noise and pressure, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except feel the world tear itself apart around me. My ears rang with a high, piercing whine. My vision blurred and doubled. I tasted blood and dust and something chemical that burned the back of my throat. When I could see again, the building across the street was gone, just gone. In its place was a crater, wide and deep and still smoking, the edges glowing faintly red with heat. And around the crater, piled high and scattered far, was rubble, twisted metal and broken stone and things I didn't want to look at too closely, things that might have been furniture or machinery or bodies. It was impossible to tell. People were screaming, running, pulling things from the wreckage with their bare hands, their faces twisted with desperation and grief. A woman stumbled past me, her clothes torn and bloodied, carrying something small and limp in her arms. She was sobbing, repeating a name over and over, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. Sierra grabbed my hand and pulled me to my feet. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but her voice was steady, calm, as if we were still in the classroom, as if this were just another drill. "Come on," she said. "We have to go." We ran. Not toward shelter, not toward safety, just away, down the transit corridor, past the screaming and the fire and the smell of burning flesh, our feet pounding against the rockcrete in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. My mother was waiting at the door when we arrived, her face white and drawn, her hands shaking as she pulled me inside and held me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "You're all right," she whispered, over and over, her breath hot against my hair. "You're all right. You're all right." But I wasn't. None of us were. We were just still alive. And in Verun Tertius, that was the closest you got to all right. That night, I lay in my cot and stared at the ceiling. The building still shook with the rhythm of distant artillery. The impacts so constant they'd become a kind of white noise, a lullaby that sang you to sleep if you let it. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about the crater, about the rubble, about the things I'd seen that might have been bodies. But every time I drifted towards sleep, I saw it again, the flash of light, the wave of heat, the moment when the world ended for everyone inside that building. And I thought, for the first time, that maybe the walls wouldn't always keep us safe. That maybe there was nowhere safe, not really. That maybe we were all just waiting for our turn to disappear into smoke and ash and the daily casualty lists. But I didn't say that out loud, because saying it would make it real. And I wasn't ready for that yet. The next morning, Madame Vrel read the names again. 63 dead, 14 missing. I recognized 5 of them, 2 from my block, 3 from school. We sat in silence and listened. And then we recited the creed. The Emperor protects. The faithful endure. Fear is weakness. Obedience is strength. I believed it. I had to, because if the Emperor didn't protect us, then no one did. And that was a thought too terrible to hold. One evening, after the sirens had quieted and the bombardment had slowed to its usual rhythm, I asked my mother why the walls shook so much. She was stirring a pot of grey sludge over the heating coil. Our dinner, such as it was, reconstituted protein paste mixed with whatever starch the ration distributors had available that week. She didn't look at me when she answered, just kept stirring, her movements slow and mechanical. "That means we survived another morning," she said quietly. I nodded, and I didn't ask again, because I understood now. The shaking wasn't something to be feared or questioned. It was just proof that we were still here, still breathing, still waiting for the next shell to fall. In Verun Tertius, survival wasn't a goal. It wasn't something you worked toward or hoped for. It was just what happened in the spaces between the sirens. And that was all we had. The Imperial Guard came on a day when the sky was the color of old bruises, purple and black and swollen with smoke that hung low enough to touch if you climbed to the upper transit levels and reached through the broken windows. We'd been told they were coming for weeks. The news trickling down through the Vox broadcasts and the whispered conversations of adults who thought we weren't listening. Reinforcements, they said. Fresh troops from off-world. Soldiers who'd fought real battles on real fronts, not just sat in crumbling hives and waited to die. Hope arrived with those whispers, fragile and desperate. The first time in years I'd heard adults speak about the future as if it was something that might actually exist. We heard them before we saw them, the deep, grinding rumble of engines, the rhythmic thunder of boots striking stone in perfect unison, a sound so foreign to our world of chaos and disorder that it made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. The adults said to stay inside, to keep away from the transit corridors, to let the soldiers pass without interfering. But children don't follow orders when there's something worth seeing. We ran to the main avenue, a wide corridor carved through the hive's industrial sector, and pressed ourselves into the crowd that had gathered despite the warnings, despite the danger, despite everything. And then they appeared, the Imperial Guard. Rows and rows of them, stretching back farther than I could see, their formation so precise it looked like a single organism moving through the hive's twisting streets. They wore flak armor, painted in dull greens and browns, the colors of worlds I'd never seen, worlds with dirt and grass and things that grew. Their faces were hard, weathered by wind and sun, and things I had no context for, etched with scars that told stories I couldn't read. Some were young, barely older than the teenagers conscripted from our manufactorums. Others were ancient, their skin leathered and lined, their eyes carrying the weight of decades spent killing and dying in the Emperor's name. But all of them moved with the same purpose, the same grim determination, their lasguns held at parade rest, their eyes fixed forward on some distant horizon only they could see. The crowd cheered, actually cheered, a sound so rare in Ver and Tertius that it took me a moment to recognize it. Voices raised in something other than fear, or grief, or mechanical recitation of doctrine. Hope, raw and desperate and probably foolish, but real. I felt it too. Felt something uncurl in my chest that I'd thought was dead. Felt myself standing taller, breathing deeper, as if the mere presence of these soldiers could hold back the darkness that had pressed in on us for as long as I could remember. Banners unfurled from the upper levels, massive sheets of canvas someone had saved for this moment, painted with Aquilus and Gothic script that blazed in letters 2 meters high. The Emperor protects. Voxcasters mounted on the walls blared martial hymns, crackling anthems I'd heard 1,000 times but never felt, never believed. And someone I never found out who started singing. Not the flat, mechanical recitation we did in school, but actual singing, voices joining together in harmony, in shared purpose, in the kind of unity I'd only read about in Imperial propaganda. The guardsman didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the crowd except for the occasional flicker of eyes toward the cheering masses. Quick assessments followed by immediate refocus on the march. They were professionals, soldiers, and they'd learned, probably long before they arrived here, that crowds who cheered when you arrived were the same crowds who cursed your name when you failed to save them. But one of them looked at me. He was young, 20 at most, maybe younger. It was hard to tell with soldiers with a thin scar cutting across his jaw and eyes that were too old for his face. His lasgun was slung over his shoulder, barrel pointed down in parade rest, and his armor bore scorch marks and dents that spoke of battles survived. For just a moment, as his column passed my position, his gaze met mine, and he nodded. A small movement, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. I felt something break open inside me, something warm and painful and utterly foreign. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a flower. It wasn't much, a tiny, crushed thing I'd found growing in a crack in the rockcrete weeks ago. The only spot of color I'd seen in the gray monotony of the hive. I'd kept it pressed between 2 pieces of scrap parchment, preserving it for no reason I could articulate. Just the instinct that something beautiful shouldn't be allowed to disappear completely. I pushed through the crowd, adults trying to grab me and pull me back. But I was small and quick and desperate. I reached the edge of the formation just as the soldiers' squad passed. The entire column stopped. I don't know if someone gave an order, or if they all just sensed the break in rhythm, but they halted in perfect unison, boots striking one final time and then going silent. The soldier looked down at me. I looked up at him, and I held out the flower, my hand shaking so badly the petals trembled. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it from my hand. His fingers were calloused and scarred, the nails broken and dirty, but his touch was gentle. He tucked the flower into a strap on his flak armor, right over his heart, securing it with a precision that suggested he'd done this before, saved small, fragile things that had no place on a battlefield. He smiled. Not a big smile. Not the propaganda poster grin of heroic soldiers in the hololiths. Just a small, sad curve of his mouth that reached his eyes for just a moment. "Stay safe, kid," he said. His voice was rough, worn down by shouting orders and breathing chemical smoke, but the words were clear. Then the column moved on. He turned back to face forward, rejoined the march, and within seconds, he was just another anonymous soldier in an endless river of green and brown. But the flower stayed visible, a tiny splash of color against the dull armor, and I watched it until the crowd closed in and I couldn't see anymore. My mother found me a few minutes later. She was angry, grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, and pulled me back through the crowd, scolding me for running off, for putting myself at risk, for doing something so foolish and pointless. But I barely heard her. I was still feeling that warmth in my chest, still seeing that smile, still believing for the first time in my life that maybe the propaganda was true. Maybe we would win. Maybe the soldiers would drive the enemy away, and we'd finally have peace. I was so stupid. The guards set up their camp in the central plaza, a vast open space ringed by manufactorums and transit hubs that served as the hive's central nervous system. Their tents stretched for blocks, row after row of canvas and corrugated steel, and the air filled with new sounds, engines roaring to life, officers barking orders in clipped military cant, the constant hum of Vox transmissions crackling between command posts. The space that had been empty and dead for as long as I could remember suddenly teemed with life, with purpose, with the sense that something was finally happening. Officers gave speeches. I attended one with my mother, standing at the back of a crowd that filled half the plaza, listening to a colonel whose name I never learned shout about duty and glory and the Emperor's inevitable victory. I didn't understand most of the words he used, military terminology, strategic concepts, references to battles and campaigns that meant nothing to someone who'd never left Verun Tertius. But I understood the tone, the confidence, the absolute certainty in his voice when he said, "We are here, we will hold. The enemy will break against our line like water against stone." The crowd roared. People who hadn't raised their voices in years suddenly found them again, shouting affirmations and prayers and the Emperor's name. My mother didn't shout, just stood there with her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but I saw her eyes were wet. The hive transformed. For the first time in my life, I saw people smile without fear behind it. They decorated the transit corridors with banners made from scraps of cloth, colored with whatever dyes they could scavenge or synthesize. They lit candles, real candles, wax precious and hoarded for emergencies, and placed them in the windows of empty habs, tiny flames against the darkness. They brought food to the guardsmen, what little they could spare from their rations, offerings of gratitude that were more symbolic than sustaining but given with genuine devotion. I saw the soldier with the flower twice more, once standing guard near the supply depot, his lasgun cradled in his arms, his eyes scanning the crowd with professional wariness. The flower was still there, wilted but visible, tucked into his armor. I waved. He waved back, a small gesture that made my chest ache. The second time was 3 days later, when his squad was rotating out to the front lines. They marched past our hab block at dawn, and I ran to the window to watch. He was near the rear of the formation, and as they passed, he looked up, saw me, and gave that same small nod. Then, he turned a corner and was gone. I never saw him again. 3 weeks later, the Voxcasters crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. I was in the bunker school, half listening to Madame Vrel recite another devotional catechism, when she stopped mid-sentence. Her good eye went distant, focused on something only she could hear through the Vox bead she wore. Then, without a word, she walked to the corner of the classroom and turned up the volume on the speaker mounted there. The voice that emerged was flat, mechanical, the same emotionless tone that read the casualty lists every morning, but somehow worse because of what it was saying. Emergency broadcast. All citizens. Casualty report. 47th Veran Infantry Regiment. Engagement. Sector 12. Grid coordinates. 7-7 Alpha. Enemy contact. Sustained. Duration. 14 hours. Casualties. 832. Confirmed dead. 114 missing presumed dead. 67 wounded critical. unable to recover. Reinforcement, denied. Position, lost. The voice continued. Started reading names. The list went on forever. Each name another soldier who'd marched through our streets 3 weeks ago, another person who'd smiled or nodded or accepted our pathetic offerings with grace they didn't have to show. Guardsman Veric, Lars, age 19, killed in action. Guardsman Hollis Trem, age 34, killed in action. Guardsman Hallis Torven, age 21, killed in action. I knew that name. Hallis. I didn't know his first name, had never asked, but I knew it was him. The soldier with the flower. The one who'd smiled and told me to stay safe. He was gone, dead in some trench or bunker or Emperor knows where in Sector 12, which might as well have been on another world for all I'd ever see of it. I looked down at my hands. They were clenched in my lap, knuckles white. I was holding something, a scrap of parchment I didn't remember taking from my pocket. A note. The soldier had given it to me the last time I'd seen him, pressed it into my hand when I tried to give him another flower I'd found. The writing was cramped, barely legible, but I could make out the words, "Keep fighting, kid. Don't let them make you forget." Sierra was sitting next to me. She looked at the parchment, then at my face, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, not sadness, just recognition, understanding that something had broken that couldn't be fixed. "If heroes die," she whispered, barely audible over the voice still reading names through the speaker. "What happens to us?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because I'd just learned the answer, and it was too terrible to speak aloud. If heroes died, then there was no hope, no salvation, no one coming to save us. There was just us. And the waiting. The guard pulled out 2 weeks later. What remained of them, anyway? They marched through the transit corridors at dawn, silent now. No cheering crowds, no banners, no songs. Just tired, broken soldiers who'd learned the same lesson we'd known our entire lives. Veron Tertius didn't let go of anyone alive. The columns were so much shorter now, gaps where entire squads should have been, officers carrying the regimental standards with faces carved from stone. The banners came down within hours. The candles were snuffed. The singing stopped. The hive returned to grey silence, and it felt heavier now, more oppressive, because we'd allowed ourselves to hope, and hope had proven itself a liar. The casualty lists kept coming. Every morning, more names, more ages, more ways to die. We stopped cheering after a while. We stopped asking why. The power outage lasted 3 months, though it felt like years. One evening, the lumen strips simply stopped flickering and went dark. And with them went the hum of ventilation systems, the crackle of voxcasters, even the distant rumble of the manufactorums that had provided the constant background noise of our entire lives. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, suffocating. It pressed in from all sides like a physical weight. And in that silence I discovered that the human mind needs noise, needs something to anchor itself against, or else it begins to drift into places it shouldn't go. We lived by chemical glow sticks after that pale green cylinders scavenged from emergency supply caches, each one good for maybe 12 hours of weak illumination before fading to nothing. The light they cast was sickly, unnatural, and it threw shadows that seemed wrong somehow, stretching and twisting in ways that violated basic geometry. The shadows moved when you weren't looking directly at them, sliding across walls like living things. And more than once I woke in the night convinced something was standing in the corner of my room, watching, breathing, waiting. There was never anything there, but the conviction remained. My mother rationed the glow sticks carefully, 1 per night for the main room, none for the sleeping quarters, which meant we went to bed in absolute darkness and woke the same way. I stopped closing my eyes when I slept. It sounds impossible, I know, but you can train yourself to sleep with your eyes open if the darkness is terrifying enough. You learn to let your mind drift while your eyes stay fixed on some point in the blackness, some anchor that reminds you where you are, that you're still real, still present. Food rationing, which had always been strict, became brutal after the blackout. The daily allotment dropped to a single ration bar per person, compressed nutrient paste wrapped in wax paper, each one roughly the size of your palm and tasting like rust mixed with something vaguely organic that your brain couldn't quite identify. The bars left your stomach cramping, twisting into knots that would sometimes last for hours, but they kept you alive. Barely. People began losing weight at visible rates, their faces hollowing out, their clothes hanging loose on frames that seemed to shrink a little more each day. Children fought over food. Actually fought, with fists and teeth and desperate violence that would have been unthinkable before. I saw a boy maybe 9 years old, though malnutrition made ages hard to guess, beaten unconscious in a transit corridor over half a ration bar someone had dropped. The other children fell on him like pack animals, hitting and kicking until he stopped moving, then snatched pieces of the bar from where it had broken on the floor, stuffing the fragments into their mouths before anyone could take it from them. Adults watched from doorways. No one intervened. No one helped the boy. By the time the enforcers arrived to restore order, he was already dead. His skull had cracked against the rockcrete, and he'd bled out in the darkness while dozens of people stood nearby and did nothing. The enforcers dragged his body away without taking statements or making arrests. It wasn't a crime, I suppose. Just survival. Just what happened when people got hungry enough. His body disappeared into the reclamation system. No funeral. No name added to the casualty list. Just gone. Like he'd never existed. The plague came 6 weeks into the blackout. We never learned its name, never heard an official designation or medical terminology, just whispered rumors that filtered through the hive like smoke. Some said it was a disease from the battlefields, carried on the wind that blew through gaps in the hive's walls. Others claimed it was bioweaponry deployed by the enemy. A few insisted it was the Emperor's judgment on the unfaithful. The truth didn't matter. All that mattered was that people started coughing deep, wet coughs that shook their entire frames and left blood speckling their lips and chins. Once you started coughing, you didn't stop. The Medicae teams arrived wearing full hazard suits, bulky yellow things with sealed rebreathers that made them look like grotesque insects. They moved through the hab blocks methodically, scanning residents with handheld devices that clicked and hummed, testing for the pathogen, marking doors with red paint when they found infections. Red meant quarantine. Red meant the door would be sealed from the outside and you wouldn't be allowed to leave. Red meant you were already dead, even if your heart was still beating. I watched them drag a girl from the floor below ours mirror, I think her name was. 10 years old with blonde hair her mother kept in tight braids. She screamed when they pulled her from her family's quarters, screamed for her mother, who stood in the doorway sobbing but not moving, not fighting, just watching as they carried her daughter away. The Medicae didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't offer comfort, just grabbed her arms and legs and hauled her into the corridor, sealing the door behind them with industrial adhesive that hissed and smoked as it cured. Mira's mother pressed her hands against the door and wailed. The sound echoed through the entire block, a raw animal grief that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. It went on for hours, then days, then it stopped suddenly, and when I walked past their door, a week later, the red mark had been replaced with black. Black meant everyone inside was dead. Sierra's family received the red mark on day 43. I'd been keeping count, scratching tallies into the wall beside my cot when my mother wasn't looking, needing some way to measure time in a world where days blurred together into undifferentiated grey. Their door glowed faintly in the dim light of the glow sticks, the red paint still wet, and I stood in the corridor staring at it while my chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice. Sierra came to the door once. She couldn't open it, the Medicae had sealed it, but she pressed her mouth close to the gap between door and frame and spoke through the narrow opening. "It doesn't hurt much," she said. Her voice was quiet, calm, the same tone she'd used when explaining how she stayed still during bombardments. "Not yet. Mother says it will get worse, but right now it's just coughing. And tired. I'm very tired. You'll be fine," I said. The words felt like ashes in my mouth, lies so transparent they barely qualified as comfort. Maybe. There was a pause. I heard her breathe, heard the wet rattle in her lungs that meant the plague had already progressed further than she was admitting. "Can you do something for me? Anything. Forget me quickly, before it hurts too much. Before you start remembering things we did and places we went," and her voice caught. "Just forget. It's easier that way." "I can't." "You can. You have to. Promise me." I didn't promise. Couldn't. Just stood there with my palm pressed against the cold metal of the door, feeling her presence on the other side, Knowing this was the last time I'd ever speak to her, she waited for a response. And when none came, I heard footsteps retreating into the darkness of her family's quarters. I never saw her again. The plague burned through the lower levels for 6 weeks, then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The Medicaid team stopped coming. The red marks were replaced with black marks as families died in sealed rooms. Then the marks were painted over entirely, and new families were assigned to the emptied habs, people brought up from even lower levels to fill the spaces the dead had left behind. No one spoke of the plague after it ended. No one mentioned the names of those who died. It was as if an entire section of the hive's population had simply ceased to exist, erased from memory and record with the same efficiency they'd been erased from life. I tried to remember Sierra, tried to hold on to the details, her face, her voice, the way she moved, but the memories faded faster than I expected, bleeding away like water through cracked stone, until all I had left was the knowledge that she'd existed and then stopped. And even that felt uncertain, dreamlike, as if I might have imagined her entirely. Maybe that was better. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe forgetting quickly was a mercy. The sky outside turned black during the 6th month. Not the grey black of smoke and ash we'd lived under our entire lives, but a deep, absolute blackness that seemed to swallow light entirely. The manufactorums had restarted when the power returned partial power, barely enough to keep critical systems running, and their chimneys belched plumes of chemical waste into the atmosphere 24 hours a day, thick clouds of toxins that accumulated in layers until they formed a permanent shroud. The sun disappeared. I don't mean it was hidden behind clouds or obscured by smoke. I mean it simply stopped existing as far as we were concerned. Day and night became meaningless distinctions, just arbitrary labels we applied to shifts in the dim artificial lighting that replaced natural illumination. People stopped keeping track of time, stopped marking calendars or counting days. We just existed in the endless grey twilight, working and sleeping and dying in cycles that might have been days or weeks or months. Impossible to tell. My neighbor, Grevik, the old man who'd lived 3 doors down for as long as I could remember, was crushed when a section of his ceiling collapsed during a particularly heavy bombardment. I heard the crash from my quarters, felt the building shake, and ran to help before I'd even registered what I was doing. By the time I reached his door, half his room was buried under rockcrete and twisted rebar. Jagged chunks of ceiling that had fallen in a single massive piece. I could see his hand sticking out from under the rubble. The fingers were curled slightly, as if he'd been reaching for something when the ceiling fell. The hand wasn't moving. I tried to dig him out, grabbed pieces of debris and pulled them away, my palms shredding on the sharp edges, my arms burning with effort. But the pieces were too heavy, too many, and after an hour of futile work, I had to stop, sit down in the corridor, and accept that he was gone. No one came to help. Not the emergency teams, not the enforcers, not the neighbors who must have heard the crash. After a day, an overseer arrived, looked at the scene for maybe 30 seconds, and marked Grevik's door with a black X. Then he left. The hand stayed visible for 3 more days before someone finally cleared enough debris to pull the body out. By then, it had started to decompose, the fingers swollen and discolored, the smell seeping into the corridor despite the recycled air. They dragged what remained to the reclamation furnaces, and Grevik joined the thousands of others who'd been rendered down into component chemicals and nutrients. His name never appeared on the casualty list. Too insignificant, I suppose. Too routine. Children stopped drawing pictures of animals or families or anything from the world outside. I saw this happen gradually, noticed it first when Madame Vrel started hanging new artwork on the classroom walls. Where there had once been crude sketches of pets or parents or imagined meadows, now there were only pictures of war. Tanks rendered in careful detail, soldiers in firing positions, explosions captured mid-burst, flames and debris frozen in the moment of violence, bodies lying in streets, limbs at wrong angles, faces blank. One child drew nothing but skulls, hundreds of them, covering every centimeter of the parchment in tiny, meticulous detail. Each skull slightly different, some cracked, some intact, some with jaws hanging open in silent screams. Madame Vrel hung it in the center of the wall, and no one commented. These were the images that lived in our minds now. The only reality we knew. One day, Madame Vrel stopped mid-lesson, her voice trailing off in the middle of reciting the Catechism of Obedience, and just stared at the walls covered in children's drawings of death. Her face had gone pale, her one good eye wide and glassy, her mouth hanging slightly open. Her hands trembled where they gripped the lectern. "Why?" she whispered. "Not to us. To herself, or to the Emperor, or to no one at all." No one answered. We didn't understand the question. This was normal. This was what life looked like. What else would we draw? She cleared her throat after a long moment, composed herself with visible effort, and continued the lesson. The Emperor protects. The faithful endure. Fear is weakness. Obedience is strength. We recited the words back to her, our voices flat and mechanical, and I wondered if she believed them any more than we did. That night, I saw a holovid. Someone had managed to restore one of the public view screens in the transit corridor, and they were broadcasting Imperial propaganda images of peaceful worlds, recruitment messages, scenes designed to inspire loyalty and devotion. I stopped to watch, drawn by the novelty of moving images, of color, of anything that wasn't gray and broken. The image showed a world I didn't recognize. Green fields stretching to a horizon that actually existed, not blocked by walls or buildings or smoke. A blue sky actually blue. A color I'd only seen in faded instructional picts, not the gray or black I'd lived under my entire life. And children playing in open spaces, running and laughing, their faces clean and bright and utterly alien. I stared at that image for maybe 5 minutes, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to understand that such places actually existed somewhere in the galaxy, that not everyone lived the way we lived. I turned to my mother, who'd stopped beside me to watch. "Is that real?" She looked at the screen, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "No, but it looks. It doesn't matter what it looks like." Her voice was sharp, harder than I'd heard it in years. "That world doesn't exist. Not for us, maybe not for anyone. It's just propaganda. Pictures meant to keep you working, keep you compliant, keep you from realizing there's nowhere else to go." She reached out and turned off the screen, plunging us back into the familiar grey darkness. That night I lay in my cot and tried to imagine what grass felt like, what the sun looked like without smoke filtering it to nothing, what it meant to laugh, to play, to spend a day not defined by fear and violence. I couldn't. My imagination had limits, and those limits were defined by the walls of Verun Tertius. I'd lived my entire life in war, and I had no framework for understanding peace. That night I learned to sleep with my helmet on. My mother had scavenged it from somewhere, a small, dented thing that was too large for my head and smelled like rust and sweat and someone else's terror. It pressed uncomfortably against my skull, made my neck ache. But she insisted. "Shrapnel doesn't care if you're sleeping," she said. "Doesn't care if you're tired or young or innocent. It just kills. So you wear the helmet." I wore it. And I learned to sleep despite the discomfort, despite the way it rattled when I moved, despite knowing that the person who'd worn it before me was almost certainly dead. Because in Verun Tertius, you didn't inherit from the living. We learned to sleep with helmets on, because shrapnel didn't wait for morning. I was 13 years old when the conscription officers came to our hab block, though the number meant nothing anymore. Age just another abstract measurement in a world where time had ceased to function properly. They arrived in the pre-dawn hours, not that dawn meant anything in the permanent twilight we'd lived under since the blackout, moving through the corridors with data slates and scanning equipment, their voices sharp with authority that allowed for no argument, no negotiation, no mercy. My mother heard them before I did, woke me with a hand clamped over my mouth and dragged me from my cot with desperate strength, shoving me toward the ventilation duct behind our small heating unit. "Get in," she hissed, her voice raw with fear I'd never heard before. "Don't move, don't breathe, don't make any sound." I squeezed into the duct, my body folding into the cramped space that smelled of rust and stale air, and watched through the narrow gap as she pushed the heating unit back into place, concealing the opening. Through the thin walls, I could hear boots in the corridor, doors being pounded open, voices raised in protest and then silenced, the rhythmic beeping of scanning equipment as it catalogued every living body in the block. They found me anyway. They always did. The heating unit was shoved aside with casual violence, metal scraping on rockcrete, and hands grabbed my arms and pulled me out into the harsh light of the glow sticks. The officer who'd found me was middle-aged, his face worn smooth by years of doing this same task over and over, his eyes carrying the dead expression of someone who'd stopped seeing children as anything except numbers on a list. He scanned my wrist with a handheld device that beeped twice, noted something on his data slate, and nodded toward the door. "Old enough," he said. His voice carried no emotion, no judgment, no acknowledgement that what he was doing might matter. "Report to Manufactorum 76 by 6th bell. Failure to comply constitutes treason against the Imperium and will be met with immediate execution." My mother tried to argue, fell to her knees on the cold floor, hands clasped in front of her in desperate supplication, her voice breaking as she begged them to take her instead, to leave me alone, to show mercy in the Emperor's name. The officer didn't even look at her, just stepped around her kneeling form like she was a piece of furniture, gestured for the next child to be scanned, and moved on to the next hab. "6th bell," he repeated over his shoulder. Then he was gone, and I was left standing in the doorway while my mother sobbed on the floor. I reported to Manufactorum 76 at the appointed time. So did roughly 200 other children, all of us pulled from different hab blocks across the sector, all of us carrying the same expression, not fear. Exactly, but a kind of numb resignation, the look of people who'd known this was coming and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. We were lined up in rows in the loading bay, a vast space filled with crates and machinery and the chemical smell of industrial solvents, and inspected like livestock by overseers who prodded us with shock sticks and measured our height, weight, strength, all the metrics that would determine our value to the Imperial war machine. I was assigned to ammunition sorting. Others went to assembly lines, to loading crews, to maintenance details. The assignments were arbitrary, based on physical measurements and random chance, and once made they were permanent. No transfers, no appeals. You went where they sent you, and you stayed there until you died or became too broken to work. The Manufactorum was a cathedral of violence and noise, a space so vast its ceiling disappeared into shadow 40 meters overhead, filled with conveyor belts that never stopped moving and stamping presses that struck with rhythmic thunder and furnaces that glowed like the heart of dying stars. The air was thick with smoke and chemical fumes, promethium, burning metal, something acidic that stripped the moisture from your lungs with every breath. The heat was unbearable, a physical presence that pressed against your skin and made your clothes stick to your body with sweat that dried to salt crusts. And the noise, Emperor, the noise was a constant assault, machines screaming and metal shrieking and overseers shouting orders over vox horns until the words became just another layer of sound, indistinguishable from the mechanical roar. My job was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Stand at a conveyor belt for 12 hours straight, inspect each artillery shell that passed for defects, cracks in the casing, dents in the primer cap, corrosion on the threading, and sort them into bins. Cracked casings went left, into containers marked for reclamation, where the metal would be melted down and reused. Acceptable rounds went right, into crates that would be shipped to the front lines where they'd be loaded into guns and fired at enemies I would never see. 12 hours per shift, no breaks except for a 10-minute ration distribution at the halfway point. No rest, no stopping. If you slowed down, an overseer would hit you with a shock prod. If you stopped entirely, they'd drag you to the discipline pits rooms carved into the sub-levels, where they broke you in ways I never fully understood but heard described in whispers, and you wouldn't come back. Or you'd come back changed, moving with the jerky precision of servitors, your eyes vacant and glassy, your personality scraped away and replaced with pure obedience. So you didn't stop. You worked through the pain in your arms, the ache in your back, the burning in your lungs. You worked through exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning, through moments where your vision blurred and your hands moved on autopilot while your mind drifted somewhere far away. You worked because stopping meant something worse than death. The other children on my line were silent, broken, already, or breaking, their faces locked in masks of concentration or blank dissociation. One girl, maybe a year younger than me, though malnutrition made ages deceptive, had burned scars covering half her face, the skin puckered and shiny where healing had occurred poorly. She moved mechanically, her hands sorting shells with practiced efficiency, never looking up, never speaking, just working with the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned there was nothing else. I tried to speak to her once. During the brief ration break, when we were allowed to sit on the floor and eat our single daily meal. "Are you?" "Don't," she interrupted, without looking at me. Her voice was flat, empty of inflection. "It's easier if you don't." "If I don't what?" "Talk. Think. Remember. Any of it. Just work." Just exist. Don't try to connect. Don't try to care. It makes it worse. I wanted to argue, to insist that we were still human, that we had to hold on to something. But looking at her face, at the scars and the empty eyes and the way her hands never stopped moving even when she was sitting still, fingers twitching in the pattern of sorting shells, I understood she was right. Caring made it worse. Connection made it worse. Hope made it worse. So I stopped trying. The overseers walked the lines constantly, their boots striking the metal catwalks above us with sharp reports that echoed through the vast space, their eyes scanning for any sign of weakness, hesitation, inefficiency. They chanted catechisms over the machinery noise, their voices amplified through vox horns mounted on every support pillar, the words becoming a physical force that pressed down on your skull and wormed into your thoughts until you couldn't think anything except what they told you to think. Your hands serve the Emperor. Your life is his property. Your suffering is devotion. Your death is duty. Work is prayer. Efficiency is faith. Hesitation is heresy. Over and over, hour after hour, the words blurring together into a mantra that filled every silence, every gap in thought, until you found yourself mouthing along without conscious decision, your lips forming the words while your hands kept sorting, kept moving, kept serving. I saw a boy lose his hand on the third day. He'd reached too far into the sorting mechanism, whether through exhaustion or distraction or simple miscalculation. I never learned, and the gears caught his fingers, pulling them into the machinery with inexorable force. There was a wet, grinding crunch that cut through even the ambient noise, a scream that went on far too long, and then silence as shock set in, and his voice cut off mid-shriek. The overseers dragged him away from the line, leaving a trail of blood that mixed with oil and chemical runoff on the floor. The conveyor belt didn't stop. We just kept working, shells passing through pools of his blood, and by the end of the shift, the blood had been tracked all over the Manufactorum floor, smeared into the metal until it was just another stain among thousands. The boy came back 2 days later. His hand was gone from the wrist down, replaced with a crude augmetic claw, cheap, mass-produced, the kind of prosthetic that barely functioned but was better than nothing. He took his place on the line without comment, and when the overseer passed by on his next inspection, the boy looked up and apologized. "Forgive me for the disruption," he said, his voice hoarse and mechanical. "I will work more efficiently now." The overseer nodded, made a note on his data slate, and moved on. I wanted to scream, wanted to grab the boy and shake him and demand to know why he was apologizing, why he was thanking them for mutilating him, why he wasn't angry or terrified or anything except grimly compliant. But I didn't, because I understood. Anger got you killed. Fear got you killed. Any emotion except obedience got you killed or worse. So you swallowed it, pushed it down into some deep place where it couldn't touch you, where it couldn't interfere with your hands or your work or your ability to keep moving when everything in you screamed to stop. The militia recruiters came a week into my assignment. They moved through the Manufactorum during shift change, scanning workers with the same handheld devices the conscription officers had used, pulling aside the older children, anyone 13 or above, for secondary evaluation. I was standing in line for my ration distribution when one of them grabbed my shoulder, his grip iron hard, and spun me around to face him. "Age? 13. Can you hold a lasgun?" I had no idea. Had never touched a weapon, never even seen one up close except on propaganda posters or slung over the shoulders of passing guards. "I don't know. You'll learn." He marked something on his slate. "Report to drill yard secundus tomorrow at 4th bell, before your Manufactorum shift. Failure to comply constitutes treason." I finished. The word had lost all meaning, become just another syllable in the endless stream of threats and commands that defined existence. "I know." He nodded and moved on to the next child. The drill yard was located in a cleared section of the hive's mid-levels, a space where collapsed buildings had been partially excavated and turned into a makeshift training ground. The floor was uneven rockcrete, scarred with blast craters and stained with old bloodstains that had soaked too deep to clean. The walls were pockmarked with las burns, thousands of them, testament to years of recruits learning to shoot at targets painted on the stone. They gave us lasguns, old pattern models, battered and scarred, the power cells barely holding charges, the housings cracked and repaired with crude welds, half of them misfired. either failing to discharge entirely or exploding in your hands with enough force to shatter fingers. We learned quickly to test each weapon before using it, to check the charge level and the barrel alignment and all the tiny details that meant the difference between killing the enemy and killing yourself. The instructors were former guard, their bodies broken by wars I couldn't imagine, and their minds hollowed out by things they'd seen and done. They taught us to shoot barely, just enough to point the weapon in roughly the right direction and pull the trigger. They taught us to march in formation, to follow orders without question, to advance when commanded and die when necessary. They didn't teach us tactics or strategy or anything that might help us survive, just obedience, just the mechanical execution of commands. When the order comes, you advance. When the enemy fires, you return fire. When your squad is annihilated, you keep advancing. When you die for the Emperor. These are the only rules you need. Simple, brutal, final. We drilled for 6 hours before our Manufactorum shifts, returned for 12-hour work details, then collapsed in our habs for whatever sleep we could manage before the cycle repeated. I stopped measuring time in days, started measuring it in shifts, in the number of times I'd woken and worked and drilled and slept, until the individual instances blurred together into an endless grey progression. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Food became a distant memory. The ration bars weren't enough to sustain the energy expenditure, and I felt myself losing weight, my ribs becoming visible through my thin clothes, my face hollowing out until I looked like the child corpses I'd seen carried to the reclamation furnaces. I watched children collapse from exhaustion and heat stroke, their bodies simply shutting down when pushed beyond sustainable limits. The Medicaid teams would arrive, or sometimes they wouldn't, and if the child was salvageable, they'd inject them with stims, chemical cocktails that burned through your nervous system and forced your body to keep functioning past the point where it should have died. The child would be returned to the line within hours, their eyes glassy and pupils dilated, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, working until their hearts finally gave out under the chemical load. No one stopped. No one complained. Because complaining was weakness, and weakness was death. One morning, a group of teen militia, maybe 20 of them, boys and girls barely older than me, were marched through the Manufactorum toward the deployment gates. They wore flak armor that didn't fit properly, helmets too large or too small, carrying lasguns that looked like they'd break if used more than a few times. Their faces were pale but set with grim determination, the look of people who knew they were marching toward death but had accepted it as inevitable. They returned that evening. Half of them were missing, the formation's gaps speaking louder than any casualty report. The rest were covered in blood and ash, their armor scorched and torn, their eyes vacant and staring at nothing. One girl I recognized from the bunker school, Vesa. She'd sat 2 rows behind me before the bombing, sat down in the transit corridor and didn't move, just stared at her hands, which were trembling uncontrollably, her fingers twitching in rhythm with some internal trauma. I knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" She didn't respond, didn't look at me, just kept staring at her hands, which were covered in something dark and sticky that I realized was blood, not hers, someone else's, coating her fingers and palms and wrists. An overseer came eventually, grabbed her arm and dragged her to her feet, pulling her away down the corridor. I never saw her again, never learned if she lived or was reassigned, or simply stopped functioning and was recycled like everything else in Varun Tertius. A psycho child was discovered in the lower habs during my 2nd month in the Manufactorum. The details were vague, filtered through rumors and whispers, but apparently the boy, 8 years old, someone said had started exhibiting abilities, his eyes glowing with unnatural light, his presence making people's thoughts feel invaded, violated. The black ships came within hours, massive void craft that descended through the permanent smoke layer and landed in the central plaza with ponderous grace that belied their size. We watched from the high windows of the Manufactorum as robed figures, inquisitorial agents or psycho handlers, impossible to tell from this distance, dragged the screaming child toward the ship's loading ramp. His mother ran after him, her voice raw with desperate pleading. But the figures didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge her existence. They just pulled the boy up the ramp and sealed the doors behind them. The ship lifted off in absolute silence, its engines making no sound at all, and within minutes it had disappeared into the smoke overhead. The boy's mother collapsed in the plaza. No one went to help her. We just turned back to our work, shells passing through our hands, efficiency never dropping even as we watched a child being taken to whatever fate awaited psychers in the Emperor's service. Propaganda posters appeared everywhere during this time, massive banners unfurled from the upper levels, printed on canvas that must have consumed incredible resources, showing Adeptus Astartes in gleaming armor, their bolters raised, their faces noble and heroic, and utterly fictional. The text blazed in Gothic script 2 meters high. They fight for you, the Emperor's angels. Hope endures. I stared at one during a rare break, my vision blurred with exhaustion, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The poster was a lie. Not because the Astartes didn't exist, everyone knew they did. Legendary warriors who fought across the galaxy in the Emperor's name. But because they'd never come here. Never would come here. Verun Tertius was too small, too unimportant, too far beneath their notice to warrant even a single squad's attention. The posters weren't hope. They were chains. Pretty pictures meant to keep us working, keep us compliant, keep us from realizing we'd been abandoned to die in a war no one cared about anymore. The Manufactorum took a direct hit during my 3rd month. I was on the sorting line, hands moving through the familiar rhythm of inspecting shells, when the ceiling simply disappeared in a flash of light and heat and overpressure that lifted me off my feet and threw me into the machinery. I had enough presence of mind to roll under the conveyor belt, covering my head with my arms. As debris rained down around me, chunks of rockcrete the size of my torso, twisted rebar still glowing red with heat, bodies or pieces of bodies that had been too close to the impact point. When the smoke cleared enough to see, half the line was gone. Just gone. Vaporized in the blast, or buried under rubble, too deep to excavate. The floor was covered in blood and oil and chemical runoff, all mixing together into a substance I had no name for, and the air stank of burning metal and cooked meat. The overseers assessed the damage, counted the survivors, marked the dead on their data slates, and restarted the operational sections of the line within the hour. Those of us who could still walk returned to our positions, stepped over or around the bodies that hadn't been cleared yet, and continued sorting shells, because the work couldn't stop. Not for casualties, not for anything. We kept working, kept serving, kept feeding the war machine that consumed us piece by piece, hour by hour, until there was nothing left except the work itself. They told us we were chosen. They forgot to say for what. I turned 17 during a bombing run, though I only knew because my mother had kept a scrap of parchment hidden in our quarters, marking days with tiny scratches she made when she thought I wasn't looking, a small act of defiance against a system that had erased time itself. She didn't celebrate my birthday, didn't sing or offer gifts or do any of the things I'd heard existed in the stories Madame Vrel had read before the bunker school collapsed for the final time. She just looked at me with eyes that carried too much grief to hold, and said, "You're still here." Not congratulations, not joy, just acknowledgement that I had survived another year in a place designed to kill children, and that survival itself was the only gift worth noting. I was still here. But almost everyone I'd known wasn't. Tarek had died in the Manufactorum, crushed under machinery during a structural collapse that no one had bothered to prevent or repair. Sira had died in the plague, her family sealed behind a door until the disease consumed them all. Kellis had died years ago, cut apart by window glass during a shelling. Madame Vrel had died when the bunker school took its final hit, buried under rubble she never escaped. The soldier with the flower had died in Sector 12, his name read on a casualty list I'd tried not to remember. Kadam, Sira's brother, had disappeared into the front lines and never returned. The boy who'd lost his hand had vanished one day, his position on the line filled without explanation. The girl with the burn scars had collapsed during a shift and been dragged away, never to reappear. Everyone was gone, everyone except me. I'd survived. Not through skill or strength or even luck, really just through the random chance that I'd been standing in the right places when death came for those around me, that I'd happened to turn left when others turned right, that the shells had fallen on them instead of me. Survival wasn't an achievement. It was just an accident that hadn't been corrected yet, and I'd learned, over the years, what survival actually meant. It meant being hollow inside, scraped clean of anything that resembled emotion or hope or even fear. It meant waking up in the darkness and not remembering what you'd dreamed, if you'd dreamed at all. It meant eating your ration and tasting nothing, just the mechanical act of consuming fuel for a body that kept functioning without purpose. It meant hearing the sirens and feeling nothing. The sound just part of the background noise of existence. Survival wasn't living. It was just not dying yet. And the difference between those two states was a chasm so wide I couldn't see across it anymore. I worked the ammunition line by day, 12 hours standing at the conveyor belt inspecting shells with hands that had developed thick calluses and permanent tremors from repetitive motion. I could sort shells in my sleep now, my fingers recognizing defects through touch alone, no conscious thought required. My body had become a machine, efficient and precise, executing its programmed function while my mind drifted somewhere far away, somewhere grey and empty where thoughts didn't form and emotions didn't surface. I drilled with the militia by night. 6 hours of weapons training and formation marching, and the endless recitation of tactical doctrine that boiled down to advance when ordered, shoot when commanded, die when necessary. My hands could strip and reassemble a lasgun in under a minute. My feet moved through marching patterns without conscious direction. My voice recited orders and responses in perfect mechanical precision. I was a tool. And tools didn't feel. But then something happened that broke through the numbness, that cracked the shell I'd built around myself and let something painful and raw seep back in. I was assigned to escort duty, a routine task, moving supply crates from the Millennium to a refugee shelter in Sector 9. Just me and 3 other militia, walking alongside a motorized cart loaded with ration packages. The route took us through the lower habs, corridors I'd walked 1,000 times, past doors I no longer looked at because looking meant remembering who'd lived behind them, and remembering meant feeling, and feeling meant weakness. But then I heard something that stopped me mid-step. Laughter. Not the harsh, bitter sound adults made when something went wrong in a particularly absurd way. Not the nervous edge of hysteria giggling that preceded mental breaks. Actual laughter, high and bright and pure, the sound of genuine joy, utterly incongruous in this place where joy had no right to exist. I followed the sound to a small alcove carved into the corridor wall, a space maybe 3 meters across that had probably been a maintenance access point before being repurposed. Inside, a group of children, 6 of them, all under 10 years old, were playing some kind of game, chasing each other in circles, their faces dirty but smiling, their eyes bright with something I couldn't name because I'd forgotten what it looked like. One of them, a girl with tangled dark hair and a gap-toothed grin, ran past me, laughing as another child chased her. She stumbled on the uneven floor, nearly fell, and I reached out instinctively to catch her before she hit the rockcrete. She looked up at me, her eyes curious and unafraid. "Are you a soldier?" I didn't know how to answer. I wore militia gear, ill-fitting flak armor, and a lasgun slung over my shoulder, but I didn't feel like a soldier. Soldiers fought for something, believed in something, served some purpose beyond just continuing to exist. I was just a body occupying space, moving through prescribed patterns until I stopped. I guess, I said finally. "Are you going to save us?" Her voice carried no irony, no bitterness, just genuine curiosity, as if the answer might actually be yes. I stared at her, my throat tightening, my chest constricting with something sharp and painful. Save them. She thought I could save them, thought someone could save them, thought there was still something worth saving. "Mira, come on," another child shouted from deeper in the alcove. And she giggled and pulled away from my hand, running back to her game, her laughter echoing in the narrow space. I stood there frozen, watching them play, actually play, like children were supposed to, chasing and laughing and being present in the moment without the weight of fear or trauma or the knowledge that they were living in a meat grinder that would eventually consume them all. They still had it. Whatever spark made people human, whatever core of self that allowed for joy and hope and the belief that tomorrow might be better than today, they still had it. And I realized with horrible clarity that I'd lost mine so completely I couldn't even remember what it felt like. The convoy kept moving, my fellow militia calling for me to catch up, but I couldn't seem to make my feet move. I just stood there watching these children play, hearing their laughter, seeing their smiles, and feeling something inside me that had been dead for years trying desperately to wake up. That night, I returned to the alcove. I didn't know why. No one had ordered me to. No one would care if I did or didn't. But I found myself walking those corridors again, found myself standing at the entrance to that small space where the children had made their shelter from scrap metal and torn canvas, watching them sleep curled up against each other for warmth. No one was guarding them. No one was protecting them. They were just children, vulnerable and alone in a world that would kill them without hesitation or remorse. And I found myself standing watch at the alcove entrance, my lasgun held across my chest, my eyes scanning the corridor for threats I couldn't name. I stayed through the night, through 2 separate bombing runs that shook the walls and sent debris raining from the ceiling, through the changing of patrol shifts and the distant sounds of violence elsewhere in the hive. I stayed because no one had protected me when I was their age. No one had stood between me and the fear. No one had chosen to care when caring was dangerous and pointless and ultimately futile. But I could choose differently. I could stand here and watch over them, even if it meant nothing. Even if tomorrow or next week or next month they'd die anyway. For tonight, they were safe. And that had to be enough. A bombing run started an hour before dawn. 3 short blasts meant distant artillery, close enough to feel but not close enough to panic yet. The children woke instantly, terror flooding their faces, scrambling for cover in the alcove's deepest corners. I moved quickly, herding them together, covering their small bodies with my own as shrapnel began to rain down in the corridor outside, hot metal fragments that sparked against the rockcrete and embedded themselves in walls. One of the children, a small boy, maybe 6, was crying, his face buried in my shoulder, his small hands clutching my armor with desperate strength. I held him and whispered words I didn't believe, but knew he needed to hear. "It's all right. You're safe. I've got you. The Emperor protects." The lies came easily. They always had. We'd all learned to lie to children, to tell them things would be fine when we knew they wouldn't, because the truth was too cruel, and they deserved a few more moments of not knowing. When the bombing stopped and the sirens faded, I pulled back and looked at them. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with residual fear, but they were alive. All of them, not a scratch. The boy looked up at me. "Will you stay?" I wanted to say yes, wanted to promise him I'd never leave, that I'd protect them forever, that I'd make sure they never felt the fear I'd felt every day of my life. But I couldn't lie about that. Couldn't make a promise I knew I'd break. "I'll stay as long as I can," I said. He nodded slowly, processing this, and then smiled. A small, tentative smile that broke something inside me that I thought was already broken beyond repair, because I saw in that smile what I'd lost. What all of us had lost. The ability to hope despite evidence, to believe despite experience, to imagine a future that wasn't just more of the same suffering. These children still had that. Barely. The edges were fraying, the darkness creeping in, but the core remained, and I wanted to protect it with an intensity that frightened me, wanted to preserve that tiny spark of humanity in a world designed to extinguish it, even if I failed. Even if it was pointless. Even if tomorrow they died and my protection meant nothing. I started spending every free moment at the alcove, brought them extra rations when I could steal or scrounge them never much, just a few extra nutrient bars or a canteen of water that wasn't too contaminated, taught them how to hide during bombardments, where to find shelter, how to read the sirens and know which sounds meant run versus which meant stay still, told them stories during the long nights, stories I half remembered from before the war became everything, tales of heroes and adventures and worlds where children didn't learn to sleep in helmets. They listened with wide eyes, hungry for anything that wasn't fear and death and the grinding horror of daily survival. And for those brief moments, telling stories in the darkness while they sat around me in a circle, I almost remembered what it felt like to be human. One evening, the girl Mira, I'd learned her name, drew a picture on a scrap of parchment with a piece of charcoal she'd found. It was crude, the kind of drawing you'd expect from a child her age, but the subject was unmistakable. A figure in armor, massive and heroic, standing between smaller figures and some dark threat I couldn't quite make out. She held it up to me, smiling. "This is you." I stared at the picture, my throat tight. "I'm not. You protect us," she said simply, as if this were obvious, as if my fumbling attempts at keeping them alive somehow qualified as heroism. Like the Emperor's angels, like the Astartes in the posters. I wanted to correct her, to explain that I wasn't a hero, that heroes didn't exist, that the Astartes were just propaganda, and I was just a broken child in borrowed armor trying desperately not to let more people die. But I couldn't bring myself to crush that belief, couldn't extinguish that tiny spark of hope in her eyes. So I took the picture carefully and tucked it into my flak armor, right over my heart, where a soldier once kept a flower I'd given him. I thought about that soldier often during those weeks, wondered if he'd felt this same desperate need to protect something fragile in a world designed to destroy fragility, wondered if he'd seen some spark in me worth preserving, some small piece of humanity that deserved to survive even when survival seemed impossible. I hoped he'd never learned what I'd learned, hoped his world had never broken the way mine had, hoped he'd died still believing that protection mattered, that standing between innocence and violence served some purpose beyond just delaying the inevitable. But I knew better. He'd known too. You could see it in the eyes of everyone who'd survived long enough to understand what survival actually cost. Childhood didn't end because you grew older. It ended because you learned that fear was normal, that violence was background noise, that survival meant losing everything that made you human until you were just a machine executing functions without thought or feeling. It ended because you learned that hope was a lie told to keep you compliant, that protection was temporary at best, that everyone died eventually, and the only choice was whether you died quickly or slowly. But these children didn't know that yet, and I would do everything in my limited power to make sure they never learned it, even though I knew I'd fail, even though the hive would eventually consume them the way it had consumed everyone else. Because someone had to try. Someone had to stand watch, even when it meant nothing. I sat with them that night, watching them sleep in their small shelter, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the wail of sirens that never truly stopped, and I realized I didn't dream of heroism anymore, didn't imagine victory or glory, or the Emperor's light finally breaking through the darkness. I just dreamed of one peaceful day, one morning without sirens, one night without fear, just one day where children could wake up and play and laugh without learning to sleep in helmets or sort the sounds of death or forget names quickly before it hurt too much. I knew I'd never see it, never experience that peace, never know what it felt like to live without the constant weight of violence pressing down from all sides. But maybe they would. Maybe somehow, against all logic and evidence and the grinding certainty of how this story would end, maybe they'd survive long enough to see a world that didn't shake every morning. And that impossible hope, fragile and foolish, and probably doomed, was enough to keep me standing watch, enough to keep me human, just barely. I never learned to live without fear. I only learned to survive it.